This is Pastor Kevin on vaccines. The topic of vaccines is one that is contested these days as well. It seems like anything that's connected to COVID-19 is contested to an extent these days. And while there's many in this world right now who are excited that it seems like vaccines are going to be available soon, and others were a little bit leery about the vaccine. And there are some guidelines that I go for myself in regards to vaccines. I, for one, am not an anti-vaxxer, but there's certain vaccines, as I've done more research about them, that I've decided for myself not to take. Some vaccines that my wife and I have researched that decide that we won't give our kids. Now, when they're adults, they can make their own decision. But while they're under our care, we make that decision for them. But we seek to do the research to find out the benefits versus the side effects of it. How's it going to be beneficial long-term, or what's going to be the detriment long-term? And it's important, I think, for any of us as Christians to make sure we weigh the facts about those kind of things. And vaccines can be a valuable tool for eradicating some diseases, but also can be a tool that's used to cause problems otherwise for other people. And so here's how I look at it. Weighing the pros and the cons again. What's the benefits? And looking through what are the benefits that it's going to bring about. Then also looking at the side effects. As they say, is the cure worse than the disease? And it's important for us to weigh that. So there are some vaccines that are good and fine. If you do research, see that, okay, these aren't problems. The ingredients show that these aren't an issue. The side effects are minimal and only last for a short time, but also protect myself for the long term. So it's good for us to look at that. But then there are some that, the side effects could have detrimental effects later down the road. And so maybe it's not the thing to take then. But then there's also the ones, like what diseases do we have vaccines for that is this a vaccine because of something that we don't have control over disease-wise? Or is it a disease or an illness that's caused by an immoral choice? That's why God in His Word tells us that sex is to remain in the marriage bed. Having sex outside of marriage, whether before marriage or an adulterous relationship, all of that God knows is detrimental. That is going to cause problems in the marriage relationship, but also can have some serious health consequences because of it. And so when it comes to STDs and vaccines for that, in my opinion, what's the need for it? As long as you live a moral life like God tells us to do, to keeping sex only within the marriage bed, then there should be little to no problem. Now, I know there's the odd case of situations like rape and incest. Those kind of ones are awful situations, and how do we protect from that? Yeah, I think that's an important conversation too. One I'm not going to get into today. But in regards to vaccines, for the most part, STDs are 100% preventable so long as you live the moral life that God tells us in His Word to keep sex in the marriage bed only. So that's part of it. Then also too, how's that going to affect things too, morally and ethically? I think it's good and important to look at those issues too. So when we research vaccines, how did they come into being? How were they used? What are the ingredients used? And how did those ingredients become into use? I think those are important questions. And the one thing caveat I'll give with that is the Apostle Paul talks about how if you go to visit someone and you have dinner with them, for conscience sake, if they're not a Christian, don't ask if it's been sacrificed to idols. Because if it is, you shouldn't partake of it. But if you are unaware that it is, then don't ask the question and just eat. And I'm going to actually apply that, even though that's not the same context, I would apply that to this too. That's why I don't necessarily tell people what my research has found in certain vaccines. So it's up to the individual. Do you want to find out? And then when you find out, you are accountable for that knowledge you have about that vaccine and how it came into being. So I think it's still important to research it However, for your own conscious sake, if you want to take the vaccine for COVID-19, then don't research that part of it. But it is still important to research what the effects are going to be short-term and long-term. And short-term, okay, maybe it's not a big deal, but long-term, is it going to be a big deal or not? It's important for each person to discover that information on their own. Second thing I also look at too is the security of the person. Now, what does that mean? Well, it's actually a term used in the Canadian Constitution talking about each person has that right of security of person, meaning the person has a right and control over their own bodies. Now, that has been sometimes used for wrong arguments for abortion. And again, that's a whole other topic for another time. But in this case, we as people should have the right to say no to what we put into our bodies. So, we also, in the Constitution also says too, that we have the right to refuse treatment from the medical profession. And so, with both of those in context, it's important for each person to decide for themselves whether they want to take the vaccine or not. Now, I know in Alberta, there is a law that talks about how the government can make a law to force people to take a vaccine. I don't know if that's part of the Canadian law or not, but I know that there's rumors that some parts of the country want to make that a forced issue. And constitutionally, and by rights that God has given us, no, we should be able to choose whether to put a vaccine in our body or not. And that's one thing I think it's important for us as Christians to understand the Constitution. Because, yes, we're supposed to be the authorities over us. And so we need to understand the Constitution when it comes to something like that, because that's the first primary law before all other laws in our country are made. And so I would put that as a side note. Make sure you know your Constitution. So for vaccines, yes, it should be your choice, because we can decide what puts into our body or not. I understand there's some laws that the government says for you can't put this in your body, and for good reasons, because mind altering or cause our behavior to be of not good sound logic or reason in a situation. For instance, we have laws saying it's okay to have alcohol, but not to drink over the limit because of the effects on our mind and our actions. Same thing with drugs. There's some that are prescribed that have to be controlled by a physician. And then there's others that are just outright illegal because there's so many negative effects of it and how it affects our judgment and our actions. And so in that cases, I think it's okay for the government to have laws saying that you can't put this in your body. But I don't think the government should have laws saying that you have to put this in your body. It's unconstitutional. And for us as people, we have the divine right to choose not to partake of any substance put into our body. So as Christians, even when it comes to this conversation too, we need to be careful in how we discuss this conversation too, because there are some who believe that it should be forced. There's even some Christians I've heard who say it should be forced on us. So when we have those conversations, when we disagree with someone on this, whether we're for or against or somewhere in the middle for vaccines, it's important for us to treat each other with the kindness and respect that God has told us to have for each other. When it's a matter of correctness and truth, God's word tells us we're to correct those in opposition to us with gentleness. Even God's word tells us too, when we share the gospel with the lost, we're to do it with gentleness and respect. So how we debate these things is important. Can we disagree? Yes. Does that mean we need to stay in that position and just continue to disagree all the time? No. I think that we can have those conversations, those difficult ones sometimes, and maybe we need a break from time to time, which is important sometimes too. But to discuss those things till we get to the point of unity of mind on it. And so it might take a long time, and it may never happen. But as long as there's still open dialogue, and we treat each other with respect and kindness that God tells us to have towards each other when we disagree on these matters. So, should you take the COVID-19 vaccine? I believe that's totally up to you and the research you do and how God is leading you in that. Again, remember, it always comes down first of all to God and what He tells us to do. If God is saying, take the vaccine, take it. If God's saying, don't, then don't. Maybe God's saying, you make up your own mind on that. You do the research and make up your own mind. And so, however God leads you in that, that's the first prime thing we must do is follow God's direction. After that, if God leaves the choice up to you, and it's not a matter of right and wrong in the situation, according to God and what His standards are, then do so. But doing the work you need to do research to find out, is this a benefit to me or not, and do the due diligence. Have all your questions answered. Yes, weigh your questions. Is this a detrimental? Is this a deal breaker or not? And then what other ones are like going, I need to answer to this, maybe not now, but down the road. Either way, it's important for us to do the proper research and then make a proper educated decision following God's leading in the situation. This is Pastor Kevin on vaccines.